Racist cop tries to evict black woman. She's the building owner. Eva stumbled into a scene so brimming with tension that each second crackles like static electricity. Picture a bright Saturday morning in Philadelphia, where the bustle of Broad Street mingles with the promise of a new day. On a quiet side street, a black woman stands on the stoop of an elegant row home turned apartment complex she painstakingly restored. Suddenly, a patrol car screeches to a halt. A furious police officer strides up, bellowing orders and threatening eviction. The twist? He's about to force out the very owner of the building. The confrontation spirals into a powder keg of arrogance, injustice, and a destiny that soon backfires in spectacular fashion. Philadelphia's real estate market had been booming for years, and nowhere was that more apparent than in the area around Temple University. Historic brownstones and row homes, once considered too rundown to fix, were receiving fresh coats of paint, modern renovations, and above all, new owners with high hopes. One such building stood on a street lined with maple trees, their leaves dancing in the early summer breeze. The facade boasted freshly pointed brick, tall bay windows, and a regal wooden door that suggested a meticulous restoration. A newly affixed brass plaque read, "Leona Walker, Proprietor." Leona had poured her heart and soul into this project. A local Philadelphian with a degree in architecture from Temple, she had saved every extra dollar she earned as a freelance consultant and a part-time adjunct professor. For years, she'd scouted the city's older neighborhoods, searching for a historic property she could breathe life back into. Finally, she found this gem, a dilapidated row home that many deemed unsalvageable. But Leona saw potential where others saw rot and ruin. She worked day and night, enlisting skilled masons and carpenters who shared her passion. Slowly, the building was rebuilt from the inside out, with modern plumbing, updated electricals, polished hardwood floors, and restored moldings that harkened back to Philadelphia's colonial charm. Once completed, Leona moved into the uppermost floor and rented out the remaining 3 apartments to tenants, most of whom were young professionals or students seeking a comfortable, stylish place to live. Saturdays were Leona's favorite day. With her arms full of groceries from the nearby Reading Terminal Market, she'd often pause in front of her building just to admire it. It symbolized resilience, history, and her own personal triumph over the naysayers. This particular morning, as she juggled paper bags brimming with fresh produce, Leona felt especially content. She had an afternoon free from teaching or consulting calls, and a new tenant was moving in. She planned to greet them with a small welcome basket, a personal touch she offered to every resident. She was about to unlock the front door when she heard a police siren blaring down the street. Instinctively, she glanced over her shoulder, noticing a Philadelphia Police Department cruiser accelerating toward her. The occupant and officer peered from behind the wheel, eyes narrowed. She thought little of it. The police occasionally cruised the neighborhood, responding to noise complaints or traffic infractions. But something in the officer's expression made her uneasy, as though he'd marked her as a target. Dismissing it as paranoia, Leona returned to her keys, determined to get inside before her arms went numb. Little did she realize that day would unravel into a firestorm that tested her patience, her rights, and her faith in justice. Leona had just turned the key in the lock when the squeal of tires made her snap her head back around. The police cruiser had pulled up at an awkward angle, half on the curb. The occupant flung open the door and stepped out a broad-shouldered white officer with close cropped hair, a squared jaw, and a permanent scowl etched across his face. His name tag read, Officer D. Hendricks. He marched toward her, left hand casually resting on his holstered weapon. "Hey, you," he barked, voice echoing against the row homes. "Where do you think you're going?" Leona glanced down at the bags of groceries. "Inside," she replied, trying to keep her voice polite. "Is there a problem, officer?" He advanced until he was uncomfortably close, ignoring her question. "Let me see some ID." Her eyes flickered with confusion. "May I ask why?" "Don't get smart with me," he snarled. "This building has had complaints, drug activity, trespassing. Landlord wants you out." Leona's pulse jumped. "Landlord wants me out? That doesn't make any sense." He jabbed a finger at the door, as if that alone was proof of his claim. "You got an eviction order in place. I'm here to enforce it." She blinked, feeling a flare of anger and disbelief. "Officer, I think you're mistaken. I'm not a tenant." Hendricks cut her off. "No, you are mistaken. I've got a call that a squatter's refusing to leave the property. Saw you fiddling with the lock. So, let's not make this difficult." The word squatter landed like an insult. Leona steadied herself, inhaling a measured breath. "This is my building, officer," she said, voice calm but firm. "I'm the owner." Hendricks let out a short, mocking laugh. "Yeah, sure. And I'm the mayor of Philly." Leona set her grocery bags down on the stoop, carefully removing her wallet. "My name is Leona Walker. I have the deed to this building in my files upstairs. I live here." "You must have the wrong address." Without waiting, Hendricks grabbed her arm, yanking it away from her purse. "Don't try any quick moves," he barked. "Hands where I can see them." She willed herself not to panic. "Officer, please." "You're making a mistake," she repeated. "There's no eviction order on this property." But Hendricks already had his radio in hand, muttering something Leona couldn't fully hear. A wave of humiliation swept over her. She saw curtains twitching in the neighboring windows. People were watching, possibly filming. A few passers-by slowed on the sidewalk, alarmed by the confrontation. "Look," she said, forcing composure. "Let me show you my driver's license. It's the same address, and if that's not enough, I'll show you the official documents inside. I have a locked file cabinet with everything." For a moment, Hendricks seemed to weigh her words, scanning her face with a deeply ingrained suspicion. Then he scoffed, shaking his head. "Stay put. I'm calling in your info." Leona stood there, resisting the urge to rub her throbbing wrist where he'd gripped her. She could practically taste the tension in the air. In the pit of her stomach, a slow burn of anger began to build. She wasn't some naive teenager. She was a grown woman, a professional, an owner of a valuable property. And yet this officer was treating her like a criminal, purely by assumption. A swell of confusion filled her mind. Who called this in? Which landlord is supposedly evicting me? There were only 3 tenant-occupied units inside, and she held all the leases. She knew none of her renters had lodged complaints. So where was this coming from? While Hendricks continued to speak in hushed tones over his radio, Leona found herself in a surreal tableau. She stood in front of her building, grocery bags at her feet, basically detained under suspicion of trespassing on the property she owned. It felt both absurd and terrifying. A tall, slender woman wearing a Temple University sweatshirt stepped forward from the sidewalk. Her name was Shanice Carter, one of Leona's newer tenants on the 2nd floor. Shanice had just returned from a morning jog and looked alarmed by the scene. "Leona?" she asked, scanning the officer with concern. "Is everything okay?" Hendricks whipped around. "Back off, ma'am, or I'll consider you an accomplice." Shanice bristled but held her ground. "Accomplice to what?" "She's my landlord. We live here." Leona offered a grateful nod. "Officer, this is one of my tenants," she said, hoping to break through Hendricks's hardened demeanor. "She can confirm," but instead of listening, he glared at Shanice. "The first only need one suspect to worry about," he spat. "Go on, get out of here before I take you in too." A flush of anger lit Shanice's cheeks. She opened her mouth to argue, but Leona shook her head slightly, signaling for calm. The last thing she wanted was for this to escalate, potentially endangering Shanice as well. "Officer," Leona tried again, carefully. "I'm happy to wait for any backup or show you the relevant documents. I'm not resisting." But you have to stop threatening us. It's unprofessional, and you have no grounds. Hendricks shot her a look that seemed to bristle with silent rage. Unprofessional, huh? He took a step toward Leona, intentionally crowding her space. Listen, lady, I've dealt with your type more times than I can count. You come in, claim you own fancy properties, and you can't even pay rent. Then you pull the race card when an officer tries to do his job. A wave of shock spread through Leona, my type. She'd been expecting sexism, maybe condescension, but not such a blatantly racist and classist implication. Her hands trembled slightly, but she pressed them firmly at her sides. Stay calm, stay calm. Before anyone could speak again, another patrol car arrived. A second officer, Officer Maria Reyes, stepped out, eyebrows knitted in confusion as she took in the scene. Leona, an impeccably dressed black woman in her mid-30s, standing stiffly on the stoop, and Hendricks looming menacingly. "What's going on here?" Officer Reyes asked, maintaining a more professional air. "Got a squatter refusing to vacate," Hendricks grumbled. "She's claiming she owns the place." Shanice piped up quickly, relief coloring her tone at seeing another officer. "Officer Reyes, that's not a squatter. That's Miss Walker. She's my landlord. She lives on the top floor." Reyes's eyes flicked from Shanice to Leona. Then she looked back at Hendricks, obviously perplexed. "You sure you got the right address?" Hendricks shot Reyes an incredulous look. "Of course I'm sure." Dispatch said 2742 Maple. Some property manager called about a trespasser who wouldn't leave. I show up. Here she is with keys in her hand. Reyes examined the keys and the building's exterior. She noticed the newly installed security camera above the entrance, the pristine plaque reading Leona Walker, proprietor, and the overall immaculate condition of the premises. Suspicion began to dawn in her eyes, directed not at Leona, but at her partner's confusion. "Ma'am," Reyes said, addressing Leona politely, "if you really do own this building, can you show me proof of ownership or a lease with your name on it?" Leona nodded, gratitude easing some of her tension. "Yes, absolutely. My apartment is on the 4th floor. I have the deed, property tax receipts, everything. May I retrieve them?" Hendricks looked ready to interject with another refusal, but Reyes put a hand up. "Let's let her prove it. We'll go with you, Miss Walker." She turned to Shanice. "You can either wait here or go about your day. I don't want to crowd the building." Shanice exhaled, relief evident in her posture. "I'll stay nearby," she said, eyeing Hendricks warily. "I want to make sure Miss Walker is safe." As Leona led them through the restored lobby, she felt an odd sense of shame for having to prove herself in her own property. The building's interior gleamed freshly painted walls, vintage sconces, and plush carpeting that showed the care she'd invested. She could feel Hendricks's judgmental eyes on every fixture, as though searching for evidence to discredit her story. Meanwhile, Reyes appeared more interested in the building's craftsmanship. At the top of the final flight of stairs, Leona unlocked her apartment door and motioned for the officers to step in. She gestured toward her tidy living room, dominated by a large oak bookshelf crammed with architecture books. She rushed to her home office, rummaging through a locked cabinet to retrieve the property deed, mortgage statements, and a set of business documents listing her as the sole owner and property manager. When she returned, Reyes studied the papers carefully, matching Leona's name and the building's address to official city stamps. Hendricks, arms crossed, hung back, face a mask of reluctance. After a moment, Reyes lifted her gaze. "This all looks legitimate. MAAM, it appears. You do indeed own this property. I'm going to need you to come downstairs with me so we can sort this out with dispatch." "Thank you," Leona murmured. "I appreciate you listening." Hendricks cut in with a snort. "We'll see about that. For all we know, these are forged documents." Reyes threw him a warning look, but said nothing. They descended the stairs, Leona's heart thumping with a mix of relief and anger. At least one officer is taking me seriously, she thought. But as for the other, his hostility was as thick as the summer humidity, and she had a feeling it was nowhere near over. Once back on the ground floor, Officer Reyes asked for a moment to radio the details in. Leona lingered near the front desk area she'd installed for mail and package deliveries, arms folded protectively over her chest. Hendricks hovered close by, glaring at the shining surfaces and the tasteful decor with something akin to contempt. Outside on the sidewalk, Shanice waited, eyes darting anxiously between the door and the passing cars. As the minutes ticked by, Reyes' side of the conversation drifted inside in faint snippets. Yes, she has documents, verified name, no sign of forced entry. Then a pause. Repeat that? Who filed the call? Leona leaned in, curiosity piqued. She noticed Hendricks shift uncomfortably. Reyes listened intently, then ended her radio conversation and returned with a baffled expression. So, I just confirmed with dispatch. The call came from a number associated with a local property management company, claims to manage 2,742 Maple. They insisted that a Miss Brown had refused multiple eviction notices, but obviously there is no Miss Brown here. And you, Miss Walker, are definitely on record as the owner. Tax bills, city permits, everything in your name. Leona blinked, trying to piece this together. Property management company, I handle all management personally. I've never hired any external firm. Reyes let out a frustrated sigh. This is unusual. Either it's a clerical error, like they meant a different address, and they messed up big time, or something else is going on. Shanice, overhearing, approached the doorway. But how would they have known to send the call right when Miss Walker was outside? She asked. This building's address is correct, but the occupant's name is wrong. A muscle twitched in Hendricks's jaw. I got the call, and I responded. That's all I know. His tone was defensive, as though covering the possibility that he might have made a personal choice in how to handle the call. Leona's frustration surged. Officer, do you realize how humiliating this has been? You tried to evict me from my own building, threatened me, and made assumptions about who I am. Even if there's some confusion with the property management info, your actions were out of line. He sneered, refusing to back down. Your attitude didn't help. Reyes gave him a sharp look, then turned to Leona. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry for the confusion. I understand you may want to file a formal complaint." A swirl of emotions roiled within Leona. She glimpsed Shanice, who nodded in silent encouragement. "Yes," Leona said, voice trembling with suppressed outrage. "I absolutely do." Reyes began to explain the complaint procedure, but Hendricks interrupted. "You can't blame me for doing my job," he snapped. "We get a call about a trespasser. We show up and see someone fiddling with the lock." Her lock, Shanice cut in, exasperated. "That's enough," Reyes said firmly, shooting Hendricks another glare. "Officer Hendricks, why don't you wait in the patrol car?" He hesitated, eyes flicking from Reyes to Leona and back, then stalked off, slamming the door behind him. The glass rattled. A tense silence followed. Reyes exhaled slowly, looking genuinely apologetic. I'm sorry," she said quietly. "He's been on edge lately. That doesn't excuse his conduct, but I just want you to know I'm taking this seriously." Leona nodded. "I appreciate that, but this needs to be resolved. Whoever called this in either made a mistake or had some motive." Reyes agreed, scribbling notes in a small pad. "I'll provide you with the contact details for the Internal Affairs Division and the city's complaint portal. Also, you might want to consider reaching out to a lawyer, just in case. Some property owners in Philly have been targeted by scam eviction notices recently. You never know. Shanice gave Leona's arm a reassuring squeeze. If you need me to vouch for you, Miss Walker, the first will. I saw the whole thing. Leona smiled thinly. Thank you. I'm sure your statement will help. She studied Reyes, trying to gauge her sincerity. Something about the officer's demeanor suggested she was the type to keep her word. Thank you for your professionalism, Officer Reyes. With that, Reyes gave a respectful nod, turned, and followed Hendrix's path out the door. Leona closed her eyes for a moment, letting the morning's tension flood out in a single shuddering breath. But as she began gathering her scattered groceries, most of which were now either bruised or spilled, she couldn't shake a nagging question: who called in that false eviction claim, and why? That evening, Leona found herself sitting at her kitchen table with a steaming cup of chamomile tea. Despite her efforts to relax, her mind churned relentlessly. After the officers left, she'd spent the rest of the day combing through her records, scanning local property listings, and even calling the Philadelphia Real Estate Board to verify no official eviction order existed for her address. Of course there wasn't. The clerk she spoke with confirmed that no eviction paperwork had been filed for 2,742 Maple in years. That left the improbable scenario of an honest mix-up, or something more sinister, a scam or an attempt to intimidate her. By the time the sun set, Leona realized she needed help. She dialed the number of her close friend and attorney, Samira Brown, a fierce civil rights lawyer who ran her own practice just blocks from City Hall. So, let me get this straight, Samira said after Leona recounted the incident over speakerphone. A random property management company called the cops to evict a non-existent tenant whose name they got wrong. The cops show up, presumably accept the call at face value, and Officer Hendrix goes full bulldog on you. That's the gist of it, Leona said, swirling her tea absent-mindedly. Officer Reyes apologized and mentioned a complaint process, but this doesn't feel like a random slip-up, Samira. The timing is just too convenient. Samira's voice carried the weight of caution. Philadelphia's rental market can be a wild west sometimes. Developers, flippers, fake property managers. Sometimes they try to scare people off so they can claim the property or force a sale. But your building is fully paid for, right? Leona nodded, glancing at her stack of mortgage statements, nearly cleared, in fact. Yes, I'm close to paying off the last bit. No liens, no issues. I'm up to date on property taxes. I even have the receipts from last month. So none of that. Then it could be intimidation, Samira mused, or some unscrupulous party who wants your building. Any idea who? Leona hesitated. She recalled an incident from a few weeks back when a real estate agent representing a wealthy developer approached her with an unsolicited offer to purchase the building. The offer was tempting, but overshadowed by an odd sense of pushiness. When Leona politely declined, stating she wasn't interested in selling, the agent, who introduced himself as Brad Collins, had been a bit too persistent, leaving multiple follow-up messages. She brushed him off, but it left a sour taste in her mouth. She relayed this to Samira, who listened intently. Collins. Name rings a bell, but I'm not sure. Let me do some digging. I can also file an official complaint regarding the police misconduct. If that officer messed with the body cam footage or used hateful language, they're in deep trouble. Leona's thoughts drifted to Hendrix's sneer and his venom-laced remarks. He called me, your type said I was playing the race card. It was humiliating. Samira let out a long sigh. I'm sorry. You shouldn't have to deal with that. Let me handle the official complaint, and I'll see what I can find on that property management company. For now, keep your documents secure and be vigilant. Thank you, Leona whispered, grateful for Samira's unwavering support. After hanging up, she checked her security camera footage from the building's entrance. Sure enough, it recorded everything. Hendricks rolling up, confronting her, his rough grabs. Officer Rice's arrival. The audio was a bit muffled, but fragments of his harassing tone were clear. That might prove valuable if he tried to deny wrongdoing. She saved the files in multiple backups, deciding to put them on a flash drive for Samira. Then she shut her laptop and tried to calm her racing mind. As she curled up in bed, exhaustion settled over her. But sleep wouldn't come easily. Outside, the city hummed with late-night traffic, a constant reminder that the world kept spinning, indifferent to her worries. Yet beneath that swirling anxiety, a spark of righteous anger lit inside Leona. She'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let some racist cop or unscrupulous property hustler bully her out of her own home. She was the owner. And if they thought they could take that away from her, they'd learn the hard way that she wasn't one to be pushed around. In the days that followed, life took on a tense undercurrent. Leona went about her usual routine, teaching her evening architecture class at Temple, consulting on a small renovation project for a friend's shop in Old City, and managing the day-to-day issues of her building. But every time she walked out the front door, she felt a twinge of paranoia, scanning the street for any sign of that police cruiser or unfamiliar faces loitering nearby. Samira worked swiftly, filing a formal complaint with the Philadelphia Police Department's Internal Affairs Unit. She also forwarded the building's security camera footage, which showed Hendricks's unprofessional behavior. The day after the complaint was submitted, they received a brief acknowledgement stating the matter was under review, with promises that someone would follow up. Meanwhile, Samira found a property management firm called Keystone Urban Realty that had a suspicious pattern of phone calls reported by local residents, random eviction claims against unsuspecting homeowners. The calls rarely escalated beyond phone threats, but in a few cases the police had indeed shown up, though no officer had gone as far as Hendricks did with Leona. Leona was livid. "So they've done this before? Does no one hold them accountable?" she demanded during a phone conversation with Samira. "Easier said than done," Samira explained. "They claim clerical errors or blame some rogue employee. It's a shell game, Leona. But if we can tie them directly to a harassing pattern, we might have something." Leona exhaled, frustration gnawing at her. "This is insane. All because I won't sell?" "Don't discount it," Samira replied. "Your building is prime real estate. If you stand in the way of a big developer's project, they might do anything to unnerve you, especially if they have connections to unscrupulous individuals in the police force, or at least an officer willing to be used as a pawn." The mention of a connected police officer made Leona's blood run cold. Hendricks's swift arrival, his unwavering insistence, could it be more than just a random dispatch call? "You think Hendricks is in on it?" "It's possible. Or he might just be a racist hothead who got the call and decided to act on his biases. Either way, Internal Affairs will look into his phone and radio logs." As the days wore on, Leona noticed subtle signs that word was spreading around the neighborhood. Neighbors asked if she was okay, having heard about the situation through whispers or social media posts. Some tenants confessed they were a bit unnerved. They didn't like seeing police presence for a bogus complaint. But mostly, they reassured her they weren't going anywhere. They supported her 100%. Shanice, especially, stayed in close contact, offering help and moral support. "My brother is a journalist at the Philadelphia Inquirer," she said. "If you ever want to talk to him, he might be able to shed some public light on this." Leona paused, considering. She hated the idea of her personal fiasco becoming front-page news, but shining a spotlight could also deter any further harassment. "I'll think about it," she said. "Let's see what Samira suggests." That same week, she received a letter slipped under her door with no postage, no return address. She picked it up cautiously, her heart hammering as she read the scrawled message, "Sell now or face more trouble." This is your last warning." Her hand shook. The note reeked of intimidation. She folded it into an envelope and called Samira immediately, who advised her to file a police report. But the irony wasn't lost on either of them. Report harassment to the same department that just harassed you? Still, they needed a paper trail. That night, Leona sat in her bedroom, the city lights twinkling outside her window. She gripped the note, tears of anger welling in her eyes. Was her dream property turning into a nightmare? Would she have to face more unwarranted visits from Officer Hendricks or someone worse? She refused to let fear guide her. "I'm not selling." The building was a testament to her grit and artistry, and she wasn't about to be run out of town by bullies. If the people behind this intimidation wanted a fight, she'd give them one, and she'd do it the right way, through every legal channel available. A week later, the tension that had been simmering finally boiled over. Leona was in the middle of repainting the hallway trim, never one to let the building's upkeep slip when the commotion started downstairs. Loud, frantic knocking on the main door, followed by raised voices. Worried, she wiped her hands on a rag and hurried down the stairs. At the lobby, she found Shanice cornered by none other than Officer Hendricks. He was in uniform again, fists planted on his hips, brow furrowed with hostility. Behind him stood a man in a cheap suit, Brad Collins, the pushy real estate agent who'd previously tried to buy Leona's property. Leona's pulse soared. She stepped forward, forcing calm. "What's going on?" Shanice glanced at Leona, clearly rattled. "He won't let me back into my apartment, says. The building has been sold and we have to leave." She looked at Collins with confusion and anger. "I've never seen this man before in my life." Collins cleared his throat. "Miss Walker, it's a pleasure to see you again," he said, tone dripping with condescension. "I'm here to inform you that my client has purchased this property and we have an immediate possession order. Officer Hendricks is simply helping enforce it." Leona stared at him, her mind spinning. "What on earth are you talking about? I haven't sold anything, and there's no court order. This is nonsense." She locked eyes with Hendricks. "You're doing this again? Did Internal Affairs ignore my complaint, or are you ignoring them?" The officer's face reddened, but he kept his composure. "Collins here has documents showing a transfer of ownership. That means you and your tenants are trespassing if you don't vacate. I'm just doing my job." "Let me see those documents," Leona demanded. She held out her hand, jaw tight. Collins thrust a folder forward. Inside were papers that indeed looked official at a glance: contracts, signatures, a notary stamp. But as Leona scanned them, her anger morphed into a furious disbelief. The property address was correct, but the seller's name was Lisa Williams, and the date of the transaction was just 2 days ago. The notary stamp looked suspiciously faint, the language riddled with mistakes. "These are fraudulent," she hissed. "I don't know who Lisa Williams is, but it's not me, and that's not my signature." Collins shrugged, an unsettling smile playing at his lips. "Must be your alias. I'm sorry if you're confused, Miss Walker, but we have the signed contract. Everything's been filed." Hendricks nodded as if that settled it. "All right, Miss Walker. Miss Carter, you need to leave or face charges." Shanice gaped. "Officer, use your common sense. We're telling you it's fraud. This is insane. Why won't you at least investigate?" He crossed his arms. "That's not my job. I see legal papers from a recognized real estate agent. That's enough for me." Something in Leona snapped. "No, it's not enough." She raised her voice, trembling with fury. "I have real deeds recorded at the city. I have the official property tax statements. And this man," she jabbed a finger at Collins, "tried to buy my property a month ago, and I said no. Now he shows up with forged papers, and you're just going to believe him?" Hendricks stepped closer, eyes flashing. "Watch your tone, ma'am." A crowd began to gather at the door, other tenants peering in worry, neighbors drawn by the raised voices. Realizing that a full-blown confrontation was unfolding, Shanice whipped out her phone and started recording. "Officer Hendricks," she said, voice steady, "we have every right to be here. The deed is in Miss Walker's name. You can't just forcibly remove us based on questionable documents. I'm filming this for everyone's protection." Hendricks's gaze flicked to the phone, a muscle in his jaw twitching. Before he could react, the sound of police sirens broke through the tension. A second patrol car pulled up, lights flashing. Officer Reyes emerged, flanked by another officer, both looking tense. Reyes took in the scene, Collins's smug grin, Hendricks's confrontational stance, Leona and Shanice's agitated expressions, and asked, "What's happening here?" Leona practically sagged with relief. "Officer Reyes, this man claims to have bought my building with fake documents. Hendricks is trying to evict us. I still own this property. This is a scam." Reyes nodded briskly, stepping between Hendricks and Leona as though physically blocking any further escalation. "All right, let's calm down. Let me see these papers." She extended her hand to Collins. He hesitated, but Reyes's no-nonsense stare won out. He handed over the folder. She flipped through the pages, scanning them with a critical eye. "Where's the official stamp from the City Recorder of Deeds?" she asked, her voice carrying an undercurrent of skepticism. Collins's composure faltered. It's in the process of being filed. It can take a few days, yes, but typically there's a preliminary stamp, or at least a verified docket number," Reyes said. "This looks incomplete." Hendricks bristled. "Reyes, we got a call. We have to enforce." She shot him an exasperated look. "We have to verify first, officer. That's procedure." Then she turned her attention to Collins. "Sir, I'd like the name of your client's title company and the contact at the recorder's office who can confirm these documents." Collins blanched, but tried to maintain his slick demeanor. I don't have that information on me right now. But trust me, it's legit." Reyes lowered the folder, her posture stiff. "Trust you? You're presenting an alleged sales contract with no valid city stamp, signed by a person who doesn't match the known owner's name. That's highly suspect." Meanwhile, the second officer spoke quietly into his radio, requesting immediate verification from the city database. Within minutes, the response crackled back. "No record of sale at 2742 Maple. Deed still in the name of Leona Walker." Collins's face flamed. Hendricks glared at the sidewalk, as though searching for a hole to crawl into. Watching from behind her phone camera, Shanice let out a shaky breath of relief. Reyes handed the bogus contract back to Collins. "Sir, one suggests you leave immediately. If Miss Walker chooses, she can press charges for fraud." She turned to Hendricks. "Officer, we are not evicting anyone. There is no valid court order, no legitimate sale. End of story." Hendricks looked like he wanted to argue, but with the second officer and the entire neighborhood watching, he didn't dare. Finally, he jerked his head, muttered something under his breath, and stomped out of the building. Collins followed suit, though not without throwing a final glare at Leona. The crowd parted, letting the two men pass. Reyes stayed behind, ensuring they left the vicinity. Only once they were gone did Leona realize her hands were trembling so violently she nearly dropped the phone. Shanice handed her. Officer Reyes rested a gentle hand on Leona's shoulder. "I'm sorry you had to go through that again. I'll write up a report. You can absolutely press charges for attempted fraud or harassment. The evidence is pretty damning." Leona nodded, tears of frustration pooling in her eyes. "Thank you for stepping in. I'm definitely filing charges. And a complaint again about Hendricks." Reyes gave a grim nod. "Internal Affairs already had your initial complaint, Miss Walker. This gives them a lot more to work with." Shanice lowered her phone, releasing a shaky laugh of relief. I've got the whole thing on video. No one can say it didn't happen. Leona let herself sink onto the lobby's plush bench, the adrenaline draining out of her. She gazed around the space, once a symbol of her triumph, now a battlefield for greed and prejudice. But she felt a sudden surge of resolve. They tried to strip me of my home, degrade me, and intimidate me, and they failed. Next, they'll see just how strong I can be. Within 48 hours, the hammer of accountability began to descend. Samira helped Leona file an official fraud complaint against Brad Collins and his shadowy client, naming Keystone Urban Realty as well. She also arranged a meeting with a high-ranking officer at the Philadelphia Police Department to discuss the repeated misconduct of Officer Hendricks. At that meeting, Samira produced the building's security footage and Shanice's phone video capturing the second incident, Collins's failed eviction attempt. The high-ranking officer, a Lieutenant Carter, watched with a stony expression. After the videos ended, he looked at Leona and Samira. "This is outrageous," Lieutenant Carter finally said, voice tight. "I'll be honest, Officer Hendricks has had complaints before, mostly about his temperament. But it's clearly more than just a temper issue. He's ignoring protocol and possibly collaborating with a fraudulent scheme." Samira spoke up, her tone precise. "We'd like the department to pursue disciplinary action immediately, and we may forward this to the district attorney if it appears Officer Hendricks knowingly assisted in a crime." The lieutenant nodded, jaw set. "Understood. Internal Affairs will expedite their investigation. In the meantime, Hendricks is suspended with pay, pending the outcome. I can't comment on whether he's in league with these scammers, but we'll leave no stone unturned." Leona left the precinct with a mixture of relief and lingering anger. That same afternoon, Samira's civil rights connections helped expedite a meeting with the district attorney's office, which took a keen interest in potential real estate fraud and police misconduct. They promised to coordinate with the city's legal department to see if charges could be filed against Collins and any complicit parties. Meanwhile, local news outlets picked up the story, thanks in part to Shanice's brother, who wrote an article for the Philadelphia Inquirer titled "Homeowner Harassed by Fraudulent Eviction Attempt Rogue Cop Implicated." The piece detailed the entire saga, from the first bogus eviction call to the final foiled confrontation. Social media erupted with outrage and demands for accountability. For a brief moment, Leona worried about drawing too much attention, but the flood of supportive messages reassured her that she wasn't alone. Emails poured in from community organizations and concerned citizens, offering everything from free legal resources to volunteer watch groups who'd help safeguard her property. Days later, the district attorney's office issued a warrant for the arrest of Brad Collins, citing attempted fraud and harassment. After a brief game of cat and mouse, the authorities tracked Collins down. In his statements, he tried to shift blame onto a mysterious client who'd misled him. But with the suspicious pattern of calls from Keystone Urban Realty and the forged documents in his possession, his credibility crumbled. As for Hendricks, the Internal Affairs inquiry revealed troubling radio communications and text messages that suggested he was coordinating with an external party about the eviction prior to arriving on the scene both times. In one text exchange, he'd asked, "So you want her out right now or just spooked?" The contact info belonged to a number linked to Collins's firm. The nature of their arrangement remained under investigation, but the evidence was damning. Hendricks faced departmental charges, and the DA hinted that criminal charges could follow if it was proven he willfully participated in a fraud scheme. When the news hit, the public reacted with shock and fury. Another headline from a local station read, "Philly cop under fire for collusion in illegal eviction plot." Calls for better oversight and training soared, and the police department scrambled to handle the PR nightmare. Leona, watching these developments unfold, felt the tension in her chest begin to loosen. It wasn't a triumphant glee. She was too exhausted, too aware of how the system could still fail. But it was a relief, a sense of vindication that perhaps justice would be served and that her ordeal could help spark reforms. Late one night, she sat in her living room, sipping a glass of wine. The building was quiet, the tenants asleep. She gazed at the meticulously restored walls, the gentle overhead lighting, the framed architectural sketches that lined the hallway. Each detail reminded her why she'd fought so hard to buy and restore this place. It was more than a building, it was her legacy, a living testament to her passion and resilience. Karma does come around, she thought, remembering the raw humiliation she felt when Hendricks first grabbed her arm. Now he was suspended, possibly facing a criminal record. Collins, the smug real estate hustler, was arrested. She took no sadistic pleasure in their downfall, but she felt a quiet satisfaction that truth had spoken louder than their lies. She finished her wine, set the glass aside, and let out a long breath. Tomorrow there would be more steps to take: court dates, testimony, formal statements. But tonight she allowed herself a moment of peace, grateful that, at least in this instance, the system seemed to be righting a wrong. Several months later, the hustle and bustle of life in Philadelphia continued, but the scandal that once engulfed Leona had left indelible marks on the city's discourse about policing, property scams, and racial bias. Under public pressure, the Philadelphia Police Department enacted new guidelines for verifying eviction orders before officers could enforce them. Meanwhile, the district attorney's office launched a task force focused on real estate fraud, teaming up with community organizations to raise awareness about paper terrorism, bogus legal documents used to intimidate homeowners. In a packed courtroom at the Philadelphia City Hall, the final chapter of Leona's ordeal played out. Brad Collins pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy to commit illegal eviction. It turned out that he was part of a network of unscrupulous realtors who targeted minority-owned properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods, forging titles to force sales or scare owners into giving up. Leona testified, recounting the intimidation, the forged documents, and Collins's arrogant attempts to take over her building. Shanice also appeared as a witness, describing both incidents and providing her phone footage. The judge listened intently, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief at the brazenness of the scheme. In the end, Collins was sentenced to serve time and pay hefty fines, with additional restitution earmarked for victims of his fraud. His real estate license was permanently revoked. Keystone Urban Realty faced investigations from multiple agencies and soon collapsed under the weight of lawsuits. Officer Hendricks's hearing with Internal Affairs concluded a week later, resulting in his termination from the force. The DA pressed charges for his role in the conspiracy, although the final verdict was pending at the time. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked Leona for her reaction. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. She offered a measured smile. "I'm relieved. Justice is being served," she said. "But this isn't just about me. This is about protecting every homeowner from predatory scams and ensuring law enforcement treats all citizens with respect. No one should fear being evicted from their own home by a forged piece of paper and a biased police officer." The next day, she returned to her building to find her tenants waiting with small bouquets of flowers and handwritten thank you notes. They appreciated her perseverance, her refusal to sell out, and her commitment to making the building a true home. As she arranged the flowers in a vase on the lobby's antique sideboard, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the large mirror. The lines of stress she'd carried in recent weeks seemed softened. She looked tired, yes, but also resolute, standing taller, more confident. And so the building on Maple Street lived on, a testament to one woman's love for historic restoration, her unwavering stance against injustice, and her community's collective strength. The humiliating day when a racist cop tried to evict its rightful owner had morphed into a spark for broader change. Leona remembered that initial confrontation on the stoop, her groceries scattering, her dignity challenged. She could still feel the sting of Hendrix's grip on her arm. Yet now, it felt like a distant echo, overshadowed by the echoes of the court's gavel, the roars of public support, and the unstoppable march of truth. Philadelphia had always been a city of resilience, founded on principles of liberty and justice, often messy, forever evolving. In that spirit, Leona carried on with her mission to restore and preserve its historic architecture, undeterred. She was, after all, the real deal, the building owner, the one who fought back and prevailed against those who thought they could trample her rights. Thank you for journeying through this gripping tale of injustice, triumph, and well-deserved karma. We witnessed how a moment of blatant prejudice and arrogance when a racist cop tried to evict a black woman from her own property ignited a chain of events that exposed corruption, toppled a fraudulent real estate scheme, and brought overdue accountability to law enforcement. Leona's courage and resolve proved that truth can prevail against even the most audacious lies, especially when communities stand together to demand better from those who wield power. If you found this story moving or enlightening, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support ensures that real-life stories of perseverance, justice, and change continue to reach those who need them most. Together, we can shine a light on wrongdoing, celebrate resilience, and inspire one another to protect our rights no matter what challenges lie in wait. Thank you for watching.